Hello, my sensitive friends. Welcome to Sensitive Storytime. My name is Carolina Mariposa, and I am the founder of Butterfly Grove, where I support highly sensitive children, teens, and parents. And Sensitive Storytime is my offering for our youngest highly sensitive people to learn about the trait of sensitivity through stories. Today's story is one of a series of books that were written in the 1970s, which is so long before you were born. But it's a special series that talks about different types of people by making each story about a different type of person. So, for example, there is a Mr. Messy. There's a Mr. Sneeze, who sneezes a lot. There's a Mr. Bounce, who's very bouncy. And today we're going to read the story of Mr. Quiet. If you haven't heard of this series of books, I encourage you to check it out. The Little Misses are amazing too. There's Little Miss Trouble, Little Miss Chatterbox. Those are some of the favorites in our house. Little Miss Stubborn. So many fun stories about what it's like to have different feelings and different traits. And I picked Mr. Quiet today because I feel like a lot of highly sensitive people are seen as very quiet and shy. So you can see this is a very tiny book, and what I'm going to do today is show you the pictures while I'm reading the page that is behind the picture. So I'm going to put my glasses on so that I can see what I'm reading. And again, this is Mr. Quiet by Roger Hargreaves. There's Mr. Quiet's house. Mr. Quiet liked the quiet life. He lived quietly in a small little cottage in the middle of a wood. The problem was that small little cottage was in the middle of a wood in the middle of a country called Loudland. Everything and everybody in Loudland was noisy. Oh, the noise. Oh. I don't live in Loudland, but sometimes it feels like I do. Oh. Dogs didn't go woof like dogs you know. They went woof. So loud. People didn't shut their doors like you or I shut our doors. They slammed them. Bang! People didn't talk to each other. They shouted at each other. Hello, they'd shout as they met in the street. And you've heard about something being as quiet as a mouse, haven't you? Not in Loudland. They had the noisiest mice in the world. Squeak! Squeak! They'd roar at each other. Oh my goodness. Oh, here he is, Mr. Quiet. Mr. Noisy would have liked living in Loudland. He'd have loved it, but Mr. Quiet didn't. Noise frightened him. So he stayed in his cottage in the middle of his wood as much as he could. That's what I would do too. But of course he couldn't stay there all the time. Every week, for instance, he had to go shopping. He used to creep into the grocer's shop. "Good morning," bellowed the grocer. "What can I do for you?" "Please," whispered Mr. Quiet. "Could I have some cornflakes, please?" "What?" "Cornflakes, please," he whispered. "Speak up." Mr. Quiet tried his loudest whisper. "Cornflakes." "Can't hear you," shouted the grocer. "Next, please." Poor Mr. Quiet had to creep away without any cornflakes. It wasn't fair, was it? He crept into the butcher's. "Please," he whispered, "I'd like some meat." The butcher didn't even hear him. He was humming to himself, loudly and fiercely. Mr. Quiet tried again. "Please," he whispered, "I'd like some meat." The butcher started to whistle. It sounded more like a burglar alarm than a whistle. Oh my goodness. Mr. Quiet fled, empty-handed. It often happened, which probably explains why he was so little. Poor Mr. Quiet. He sat at home that night with a feeling of despair. "Whatever am I to do?" he thought. "It's no use," he thought. "I'll have to try again." And so the following day he went shopping again. But the same thing happened. No. "Can't hear you," thundered the grocer. "Next, please." "Can't hear you," bellowed the greengrocer. "Next, please." "Can't hear you," roared the milkman. "Next, please." "Can't hear you," boomed the butcher. "Next, please." Oh dear! Poor Mr. Quiet went home and went to bed, hungry. Oh my goodness. The morning after, he was awakened by a noise which sounded like bombs dropping. It was the Loudland postman knocking at Mr. Quiet's door. Bang, bang, bang! Mr. Quiet went and opened the door. "Morning!" shouted the postman. "Letter for you." Oh, so stressful. Mr. Quiet took the letter into his kitchen. He sat down to open it. He waited until the noise of the postman's footsteps died away. Clump, 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 clump. Mr. Quiet opened the letter in excitement. He'd never had a letter before. It was from Mr. Happy in Happyland. An invitation to stay. Mr. Quiet was overjoyed. He rushed upstairs and packed his bag and set off that very morning. Here he is, Mr. Happy's door. It was late when he arrived at Mr. Happy's doorstep. He knocked on Mr. Happy's door. Tap, tap, tap. Very quiet knock. Look, there's Mr. Happy. Mr. Quiet. Mr. Happy opened the door. "Hello," he smiled. "I thought I heard something. You must be Mr. Quiet. Well, don't just stand there. Come in and have some supper." It was the first proper meal Mr. Quiet had had for months. And while he was eating, he told Mr. Happy all about the problems he'd been having in Loudland. Mr. Happy was most sympathetic. Oh, I'm sure he feels so good having someone to talk to. So stressful. Over breakfast the following morning, Mr. Happy told Mr. Quiet that he'd been thinking about his problem. "I think," he said, "that under the circumstances you'd better stay here in Happyland." Mr. Quiet's face lit up. "And," continued Mr. Happy, "we'll find you a house. And," he went on, "a job." Mr. Quiet's face dropped. "I'm not very good at jobs," he confessed, "because I'm too quiet." "Ah," smiled Mr. Happy, "I have the very job for a quiet chap like you." And so the very next day, Mr. Quiet started work, and he loves it. Do you know where he works? In the Happy Lending Library. As you know, everybody who goes into a library has to be very quiet, and only whispering is allowed. What a clever idea of Mr. Happy's, wasn't it? And these days, Mr. Quiet is as happy as can be. Why, only the other day, do you know what he did on his way home from work? He was so happy he laughed out loud. Can you imagine? Next, please. So that's the end of our story. What do you think? Mr. Quiet. I was really scared for Mr. Quiet there for a while. It was so sad that nobody would listen to him. You know, if I had been one of those grocers, I was thinking about it, I would have said, you know, I can't hear you, but can you whisper it into my ear? And I would try to really hear what they were saying, but those grocers didn't even try. That made me sad for Mr. Quiet. And it became kind of life-threatening, didn't it? Because he couldn't get any food. That's terrible. And I know for a lot of us who feel really sensitive and quiet, it's hard to survive in our world that's very loud. We feel like nobody might care what we have to say, or that what we have to say isn't very important with everything else that's being said. But I wanted to read this story because I feel like Mr. Quiet is a great example of what happens when you find your people and the right place for you. Because Mr. Quiet found a true friend in Mr. Happy, didn't he? He found someone who really listened to him, who heard about his problems, who cared enough to help him, and he gave him a job and a home and a better life. And when he found the place, the job that was right for him, and the town that was better for him, not Loudland, no, he was in Happy Land, he was successful and happy. And that can happen for all of us as highly sensitive people. When we find our true right friends, when we find our true place that fits us, that's good for us, we too can be happy and successful. So that is why I thought it was so important to read this story, because I wanted you to have that example. I hope you'll let me know what you thought of the story. You're welcome to email me anytime with your parents' help, of course. I always put my email below. And if you think you might be interested in learning more about Butterfly Grove and my work with highly sensitive kids, I encourage you and your parents to check out my website and learn more about my services. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to next time.